The security camera footage would later show exactly 3 minutes and 47 seconds. That's how long it took Scarlett Martinez to walk into First National Bank of Cedar Falls, demand every bill in the vault, and disappear into the Montana wilderness. What the cameras couldn't capture was the moment her green eyes locked with Detective Jake Sullivan's across the crowded street afterward, or how her heart stopped beating for what felt like an eternity. Some crimes, as it turns out, don't require breaking any laws at all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special. For you, Scarlett had been planning the heist for 8 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days. She kept track because precision mattered when your entire future depended on one flawless execution. The faded notebook tucked beneath her mattress contained 247 pages of meticulous observations, guard rotations, customer patterns, and escape routes. Every Tuesday at 2:17 p.m., the armored truck would arrive. Every Tuesday at 2:31 p.m., both security guards would be occupied with the cash transfer. Every Tuesday, for exactly 14 minutes, the bank would be at its most vulnerable. But this wasn't about the money. Not really. The $340,000 sitting in that vault was merely the means to an end. Scarlett needed enough cash to disappear completely, to become someone else entirely, because staying Scarlett Martinez meant staying trapped in a life that had been slowly suffocating her since she turned 18. Cedar Falls, Montana had exactly 2,847 residents, according to the faded welcome sign on Highway 91. Scarlett knew, because she'd counted them all at least twice during her weekly walks through downtown. In a town that small, everyone knew everyone else's business. They knew her father had died in a mining accident when she was 12. They knew her mother had turned to prescription pills to cope and never quite found her way back. They knew Scarlett had dropped out of community college to work 3 jobs just to keep the family house from foreclosure. What they didn't know was that she'd been systematically studying the town's only bank for the better part of a year, memorizing every detail until she could navigate the building blindfolded. They didn't know about the lock-picking kit she'd ordered online using a fake name and a P.O. box 2 towns over. They didn't know she'd been practicing with handcuffs and zip ties until she could free herself in under 30 seconds, the morning of the robbery. Scarlett woke before dawn and sat at her kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, staring out at the mountains that surrounded Cedar Falls like prison walls. Her hands remained perfectly steady as she reviewed her timeline one final time. Walk in at 2:17 p.m., approach the counter, present the note, collect the money, exit through the rear door to the alley, drive the stolen Honda Civic exactly 2.3 miles to where she'd hidden her motorcycle, switch vehicles, take the mountain roads north toward the Canadian border. She'd practiced the route 17 times, timing each segment down to the second. She knew which roads the local police would check first and which ones they'd overlook. She knew Deputy Harrison always stopped at Null's Diner between 2 o'clock and 3 p.m. for his daily slice of apple pie. She knew Sheriff Rodriguez would be in court that afternoon, testifying in the Morrison assault case. What she didn't know was that the FBI had assigned Detective Jake Sullivan to conduct a routine security assessment of small-town banks throughout rural Montana. What she didn't know was that he'd chosen that exact Tuesday to visit First National Bank of Cedar Falls. What she didn't know was that her carefully constructed plan was about to collide with the one variable she'd never considered. At 1:45 p.m. Scarlett pulled on the auburn wig she'd purchased from a costume shop in Billings 3 months earlier. She tucked her long black hair underneath it, methodically, securing every strand with bobby pins. The oversized sunglasses came next, followed by the navy blue blazer that made her look like any other professional woman conducting banking business on a Tuesday afternoon. She studied her reflection in the bathroom mirror, and saw a stranger. Staring back, the transformation was complete. Scarlett Martinez, the girl who cleaned office buildings at night and waited tables during the day, had vanished. In her place stood someone confident, purposeful, and utterly unrecognizable to anyone who might have known her before. The drive into downtown Cedar Falls took exactly 7 minutes from her house on Maple Street. She parked the stolen Honda in the municipal lot behind the post office, just as she'd done during her practice runs. The keys went into a magnetic hide-a-key box she'd attached under the rear bumper. Everything had to appear normal, routine, forgettable. At 2:10 p.m., Scarlett began walking toward the bank. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, but her pace remained unhurried. She nodded politely to Mrs. Henderson from the flower shop and smiled. At Tommy Wilson, who was loading supplies into his pickup truck outside the hardware store. Just another day in Cedar Falls. Just another unremarkable interaction between neighbors who'd known each other their entire lives. The bank's glass doors reflected her disguised face as she approached. Through the windows, she could see exactly what she'd expected. 3 customers in line, 2 tellers at their stations, 1 security guard posted near the entrance. Margaret Cole sat at the customer service desk, probably helping someone open a checking account or apply for a small business loan. Everything was proceeding according to schedule. Scarlett took a deep breath and pushed open the door. The familiar chime announced her arrival, the same gentle tone she'd heard dozens of times during her reconnaissance visits. She'd been inside First National Bank of Cedar Falls so many times over the past 8 months that several employees recognized her by sight. Today, however, she was betting that the wig and sunglasses would buy her the anonymity she needed. She joined the line behind elderly Mr. Peterson, who was making his weekly deposit from his Social Security check. The man always took exactly 4 minutes and 30 seconds because he insisted on counting his change twice and asking about his account balance. Scarlett had timed him repeatedly. His predictability was just another element in her carefully orchestrated plan. While she waited, her eyes swept the interior of the bank one final time. The security camera in the northeast corner had a blind spot near the customer service desk. The panic button was located beneath the main teller counter, approximately 18 inches to the right of the cash drawers. The vault door would be opened during the armored truck transfer, which should begin in approximately 6 minutes. At 2:15 p.m., Mr. Peterson completed his transaction and shuffled toward the exit, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who had nowhere urgent to be. Scarlett stepped forward to the counter where Jennifer Walsh, the head teller, greeted her with a professional smile. "Good afternoon. How can I help you today?" This was the moment. 8 months of planning had led to this single interaction. Scarlett reached into her blazer pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. Her hands remained steady as she placed it on the counter and slid it toward the teller. Jennifer unfolded the note and read it twice before her face went pale. The message was brief and direct. "I have a weapon. Fill this bag with everything from the vault. No alarms, no sudden movements. Act natural and everyone stays safe." Scarlett had written the note on plain white paper using block letters with a blue ballpoint pen. Nothing that could be traced back to her. She'd practiced the wording dozens of times, editing it until she found the perfect balance between threatening and reassuring. She needed compliance, not panic. Jennifer single quotes S eyes darted toward the security guard, then back to Scarlett's face. The teller's training had prepared her for this scenario. She knew that compliance was the safest option, that the bank's insurance would cover any losses, that no amount of money was worth risking lives. "I understand," Jennifer whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please don't hurt anyone." Scarlett leaned forward slightly, maintaining eye contact. "Just follow the instructions and everything will be fine. You're doing great." While Jennifer moved toward the vault with shaking hands, Scarlett remained at the counter, projecting an aura of calm patience. To anyone observing from a distance, she appeared to be conducting routine business. Her breathing stayed controlled. Her posture remained relaxed. Every aspect of her demeanor suggested normalcy. The armored truck had arrived exactly on schedule. Through the bank's front windows, Scarlett could see the guards preparing to transport the cash delivery inside. In approximately 3 minutes, both bank security guards would be occupied with the transfer process. The timing was critical. Jennifer returned with a canvas bag containing stacks of bills from the vault. Her hands trembled as she placed it on the counter, but she managed to keep her composure. The entire exchange had taken less than 2 minutes. "Thank you for your cooperation," Scarlett said quietly. She folded the note and slipped it back into her pocket, then picked up the bag with steady hands. "Count to 60 before you do anything. Else, I'll be watching." She turned and walked toward the bank's rear exit, the one that opened onto the alley behind Main Street. Her pace remained unhurried, purposeful but not rushed. The canvas bag felt heavier than she'd expected, but she carried it as if it contained nothing more valuable than library books. The rear door opened smoothly, and Scarlett stepped into the alley. Bright afternoon sunlight momentarily blinded her after the bank's fluorescent lighting. She blinked rapidly, allowing her eyes to adjust while she oriented herself. The stolen Honda was parked exactly where she'd left it, keys hidden beneath. The bumper. This was supposed to be the easy part. She'd practiced this transition dozens of times. Retrieve the keys, start the car, drive to the motorcycle. Simple, straightforward, foolproof. But as Scarlett reached under the Honda's bumper, searching for the magnetic key box, she heard footsteps approaching from the mouth of the alley. Her blood turned to ice. This wasn't part of the plan. No one was supposed to be in this area during the transfer window. She forced herself to remain calm, to continue searching for the keys while keeping her ears tuned to the approaching steps. Maybe it was just someone taking a shortcut behind the buildings. Maybe it was a delivery driver looking for a loading dock. Maybe it was nothing to worry about. The footsteps stopped approximately 10 feet behind her. "Excuse me, miss." The voice was male, deep, with a slight accent she couldn't immediately place. Scarlett's fingers finally located the key box, but she didn't immediately retrieve it. Instead, she straightened slowly and turned to face the speaker. Man standing in the alley was tall, probably 6'2", with dark hair and intense brown eyes. He wore a navy blue suit that suggested law enforcement, though she couldn't see a badge from her current angle. His stance was relaxed but alert, the posture of someone trained to assess threats quickly. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I'm Detective Jake Sullivan with the FBI," he said, reaching into his jacket to display his credentials. "I'm conducting a routine security assessment in the area. Have you noticed anything unusual around here today?" Scarlett's mind raced through a dozen different responses. She could claim to be lost. She could pretend to be waiting for someone. She could act confused and ask what he meant by unusual. Any of those responses might work, depending on how much he already suspected. Instead, she found herself staring into his eyes and forgetting every carefully rehearsed lie she'd prepared for unexpected encounters. There was something about his gaze that seemed to see straight through her disguise, past the wig and sunglasses, directly into whatever remained of her soul. "No," she managed to say, "nothing unusual." Jake studied her face with the intensity of someone trained to read people, to detect lies and inconsistencies. His eyes lingered on her sunglasses, probably wondering why someone would wear them in a shaded alley. His gaze dropped to the canvas bag in her hands, then back to her face. "That's an interesting bag," he observed. "Mind if I ask what's in it?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Scarlett knew that her next words would determine whether she walked away from this encounter as a free woman or spent the rest of her life behind bars. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to grab the keys and attempt an escape before he could react. But she couldn't seem to make her legs move. Something about Jake Sullivan had frozen her in place, made her forget about the motorcycle waiting. 2.3 miles away, and the Canadian border beyond that. For the first time in 8 months of planning, Scarlett felt completely unprepared for what came next. "Documents," she said finally. "For work." Jake nodded slowly, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. He took a step closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne and see the fine lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though he wasn't smiling now. "What kind of work requires documents to be transported in bank bags?" The question revealed that he'd already identified the canvas bag's origin. Scarlett's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "I work for an accounting firm. We handle deposits for several local businesses." It was a plausible explanation, the kind of mundane detail that might satisfy a casual inquiry. But Jake Sullivan didn't look like someone who settled for casual explanations. His eyes remained fixed on her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed, vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with the crime she'd just committed. "Which accounting firm?" The follow-up question came immediately, without giving her time to think. Scarlett realized she was dealing with someone who knew how to conduct an interrogation, who understood that pressure and timing could reveal more than direct accusations. "Peterson and Associates," she replied, naming the first local business that came to mind. "We're located on 3rd Street. Jake's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or suspicion. Scarlett couldn't tell which, but she knew that her time was running out. Every second she remained in this alley increased the chances that someone inside the bank would sound an alarm. "I'm familiar with Peterson and Associates," Jake said quietly. "They closed their doors 6 months ago when Harold Peterson retired to Arizona." The lie hung between them like a smoking gun. Scarlett felt the blood drain from her face as she realized her mistake. In her panic, she'd chosen the wrong cover story, referenced a business that no longer existed. Any local law enforcement officer would have known about Peterson's retirement. For several heartbeats, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable, filled with unasked questions and unspoken accusations. Scarlett knew that Jake was waiting for her to crack, to confess or attempt to run, or do something that would confirm his suspicions. Instead, she found herself studying his face with the same intensity he'd been directing at her. Despite the circumstances, despite the fact that he represented everything she was trying to escape, there was something about Jake Sullivan that made her pulse quicken in ways that had nothing to do with fear. Maybe it was the intelligence in his eyes, the sense that he was someone who saw the world in all its complexity, rather than simple categories of right and wrong. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, confident but not arrogant, alert but not aggressive. Maybe it was something indefinable, a connection that transcended the roles they were supposed to be playing. "You're not really an accountant, are you?" Jake asked, his voice softer now, almost gentle. Scarlett shook her head slowly. There was no point in maintaining the pretense any longer. He knew, and she knew that he knew, and somehow that mutual understanding felt like a relief after months of deception and careful planning. "No," she admitted, "I'm not." Jake nodded as if he'd expected that answer. He glanced toward the bank's rear entrance, then back in her face. "The timing is interesting. I was just about to enter the bank when I heard someone mention a possible security concern. Something about unusual activity in this alley." The word sent a chill down Scarlett's spine. Someone had noticed her, reported her presence. The carefully orchestrated plan was unraveling faster than she could adapt to the changing circumstances. "I should go," she said, taking a step backward toward the Honda. "Should you?" Jake's question stopped her movement. Where are you planning to go, exactly? The question implied that he understood more about her situation than he'd initially revealed. Scarlett wondered how long he'd been watching, how much he'd already deduced about her activities. Federal agents didn't typically conduct routine security assessments alone, which meant his presence here might not be as coincidental as he'd claimed. "Anywhere but here," she replied honestly. Jake considered this response, his expression thoughtful rather than judgmental. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that suggested he understood something about the need to escape, to become someone else entirely. Running away doesn't usually solve the problems we're trying to leave behind. It just carries them to new places. The observation hit closer to home than Scarlett had expected. She'd spent so many months focused on the logistics of escape that she'd barely considered what would come after. Where would she go? Who would she become? How long could she sustain a false identity before the isolation became unbearable? "Sometimes running away is the only option," she countered. "Is it?" Jake asked. "Or is it just the option that feels safest?" Before Scarlett could respond, the sound of sirens began to echo through the streets of Cedar Falls. Multiple vehicles, approaching fast from different directions. Her window of escape was closing rapidly, and yet she found herself unable to move, transfixed by a conversation that felt more intimate than any she'd had in years. Jake heard the sirens too, but his attention remained focused on her face. "Those are for you, aren't they?" Scarlett nodded, seeing no point in denial. "Yes, what did you do?" The question was asked without accusation, as if he genuinely wanted to understand rather than condemn. Scarlett realized that Jake Sullivan was unlike any law enforcement officer she'd ever encountered. Someone who seemed more interested in truth than justice, more concerned with understanding than punishment. "Something I thought I had to do," she said. The sirens were getting closer. In another minute, maybe two, the alley would be swarming with local police officers who would ask very different questions in very different ways. Scarlett knew that her time with Jake Sullivan was almost over, and the realization filled her with an unexpected sense of loss. She looked into his eyes one more time and saw something that took her breath away. Not suspicion or professional detachment, but something that looked almost like understanding. As if he could see past the crime to the desperation that had motivated it, past the mask she'd worn for so long to the person she'd been trying to become. "I have to go," she whispered. Jake nodded slowly. "I know," but neither of them moved. The sirens grew louder. The stolen Honda's keys remained in their hiding place, and the canvas bag full of stolen money sat between them like a bridge to nowhere. In that moment, suspended between her past and an uncertain future, Scarlett Martinez realized that some encounters change everything, even when they last only a few minutes. Especially then. The first police cruiser rounded the corner onto Main Street just as Jake made a decision that would haunt him for weeks to come. Instead of calling out to his fellow officers, instead of drawing his weapon and placing Scarlett under arrest, he took 3 quick steps backward into the shadows cast by the dumpster behind Murphy's hardware store. "This way," he whispered, grabbing her hand. Scarlett's fingers interlaced with his automatically, as if her body had made the choice before her mind could catch up. The canvas bag shifted to her other arm as Jake led her deeper into the maze of service alleys that connected the buildings along Main Street. His knowledge of Cedar Falls layout surprised her. This wasn't the casual familiarity of a tourist or visiting federal agent. They moved in silence through the narrow passages between buildings, their footsteps muffled by years of accumulated debris and forgotten maintenance projects. Behind them, car doors slammed and radio chatter echoed off brick walls as the local police began their search. Sheriff Rodriguez's voice carried clearly in the still afternoon air, coordinating his officers with the systematic efficiency of someone who'd run similar operations before. "Check every alley, every doorway, every possible hiding spot within 6 blocks of the bank," Rodriguez commanded. Suspect is female, approximately 5'6", wearing dark clothing and sunglasses. Consider her armed and dangerous. Jake squeezed Scarlett's hand tighter as they pressed against the back wall of Chun's restaurant, hidden behind a collection of grease-stained cardboard boxes. The description was accurate enough to be concerning, but vague enough to buy them. Time. Every woman in Cedar Falls who matched those basic physical characteristics would be scrutinized, questioned, possibly detained. Why are you helping me? Scarlett breathed the question so quietly that Jake had to lean closer to hear her. The proximity sent an unexpected jolt through his system. He could smell her shampoo beneath the autumn air, something floral and clean that reminded him of better times, simpler choices. Her green eyes searched his face for answers he wasn't sure he could provide, at least not without admitting truths he'd kept buried for years. I don't know, he admitted, and the honesty surprised them both. 2 patrol officers jogged past their hiding spot, flashlights already drawn despite the afternoon sunlight. Their boots splashed through puddles left by yesterday's rain, creating ripples that caught and scattered the light. Jake recognized Deputy Martinez, no relation to Scarlett, despite sharing a surname and Officer Thompson. Both good cops who would follow procedure exactly as they'd been trained, which meant they had maybe 10 minutes before the search pattern reached this section of the alley system. We need to move, Jake whispered. They emerged from behind the boxes and continued deeper into the labyrinth of service roads that most Cedar Falls residents never saw. Jake's familiarity with these hidden passages wasn't coincidental. He'd grown up in this town, had spent his teenage years exploring every corner of it, before circumstances forced him to leave and never looked back until today. There's an old storm drain that runs beneath Copper Street, he explained as they ducked under a fire escape ladder. It connects to the creek system north of town. If we can reach it without being spotted, you might have a chance. Scarlett stopped walking abruptly, forcing Jake to halt as well. You keep saying we, this isn't your problem. The observation hung between them like a challenge. Jake realized she was right. Somewhere in the past 10 minutes, he'd begun thinking of her escape as a shared objective rather than a crime to be prevented. The shift in perspective was as troubling as it was undeniable. Maybe I want it to be my problem, he said before Scarlett could respond. The distinctive crackle of a police radio echoed from the alley behind them. Close. Too close. Jake pulled her into the recessed doorway of what used to be Morrison's. 5 and Dime, a building that had been empty since the early 2000s when Walmart arrived and changed everything. The doorway was barely wide enough for both of them, creating an intimacy that made breathing difficult for reasons unrelated to their flight from the law. Scarlett's back pressed against the weathered wood of the door while Jake positioned himself to shield her from view. If anyone looked in their direction, they would see only a tall man in a business suit, possibly making a phone call or checking his messages. Unit 7 to dispatch. The radio voice was clearer now, probably less than 50 yards away. Completing sweep of Sector 3, no sign of suspect. Moving to Sector 4. Jake felt Scarlett's body relax slightly against his as the officer's footsteps faded. But the relief was temporary. Sector 4 included the storm drain entrance he'd been planning to use. Their best escape route had just been compromised. There's another way, he murmured, his lips close enough to her ear that the words stirred the auburn strands of her wig. But it's riskier. Scarlett turned her head to meet his gaze, and Jake realized with startling clarity that he would have helped her regardless of the circumstances, regardless of the consequences. Something about her desperation resonated with memories he'd spent years trying to forget, feelings he'd convinced himself no longer mattered. What kind of riskier? The kind where we steal my rental car and drive straight out of town instead of hiding until dark. The plan was audacious in its simplicity, relying on speed and boldness rather than stealth. Every law enforcement principle Jake had learned over the past 12 years argued against it. suspects who attempted immediate flight typically made. Mistakes left evidence, got caught within hours of committing their crimes. But Scarlett wasn't a typical suspect, and Jake was beginning to understand that nothing about this situation would follow standard patterns. "Your rental car?" she asked. "Black Ford Explorer parked in front of the bank. Keys are in my jacket pocket." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The FBI agent's vehicle serving as the getaway car for a bank robber. Under different circumstances, it might have been funny. "They'll have the license plate within minutes," Scarlett pointed out. "Not if we're smart about it." Jake outlined his thinking quickly, keeping his voice low while his eyes monitored the alley for signs of approaching officers. The rental car was registered to a federal agency, which meant local law enforcement would need special clearance to access the vehicle information. That bureaucratic delay could buy them an hour, maybe two. More importantly, Jake's credentials would get them through any roadblocks that hadn't been specifically briefed about a federal agent gone rogue. By the time anyone realized what had happened, they could be across the state line. "And then what?" Scarlett asked. "You throw away your career, your entire life, for someone you met 10 minutes ago." The question forced Jake to confront motivations he'd been avoiding since the moment he chose to help her instead of arrest her. Why was he willing to sacrifice everything for a woman whose last name he'd learned from a police radio broadcast? What was it about her situation that made him abandon every principle he'd sworn to uphold? "My career was already over," he said. Quietly, "I just hadn't admitted it yet." The admission surprised him with its honesty. Jake had been going through the motions for months, collecting evidence and filing reports and testifying in court cases that felt increasingly meaningless. The routine security assessments in small Montana towns were supposed to be a break from more serious investigations, a chance to reconnect with the work that had originally inspired him to join the Bureau. Instead, they'd shown him how far he'd drifted from the person he used to be. What happened? Scarlett's question was gentle, curious rather than demanding. Jake considered deflecting, changing the subject, focusing on their immediate situation instead of his personal history. But something about their shared predicament made honesty feel necessary, even inevitable. "I spent 2 years investigating a human trafficking ring that operated through a chain of legitimate businesses," he began. "Hotels, restaurants, trucking companies. We built an airtight case, collected thousands of hours of surveillance footage, and convinced 3 victims to testify." A siren wailed in the distance, but it seemed to be moving away from their location. Jake paused until the sound faded completely before continuing. The night before the trial was supposed to begin, someone with connections high enough to matter made a phone call. Evidence disappeared. Witnesses recanted their testimony. The entire investigation was transferred to a different field office and quietly buried. Scarlett's eyes remained fixed on his face as he spoke, and Jake realized she was the first person he'd told the complete story to, including the parts that made him question everything he'd believed about justice and institutional integrity. 37 people, he said. "That's how many victims we identified. Most of them were teenagers when they were trafficked. Some of them were even younger." The weight of those numbers had been crushing him for months. 37 lives that could have been changed, families that could have been reunited, predators who could have been stopped. All sacrificed to protect someone whose political connections mattered more than their crimes. "So you requested a transfer to Montana," Scarlett surmised. "I requested a transfer to anywhere that would get me away from Washington politics and back to actual police work." Small-town bank assessments seemed like the perfect opportunity to remember why I became an agent in the first place. The plan had made sense at the time. Remove himself from the environment that had corrupted his faith in the system, return to basics, rediscover his sense of purpose through simple, straightforward investigations. Instead, he'd found himself in an alley behind Main Street, contemplating federal crimes to help a bank robber escape justice. "Maybe this is exactly where you need to be," Scarlett said before Jake could ask what she meant. The sound of approaching vehicles forced them back into motion. 2 more patrol cars had arrived, probably bringing the total law enforcement presence to every available officer in Custer County. The search pattern was tightening, becoming more systematic and thorough. They emerged from the alley system onto Copper Street, 3 blocks from where Jake had parked the Ford Explorer. The distance didn't seem far until Jake realized they would have to cross 2 major intersections while avoiding patrol cars, surveillance cameras, and the growing number of curious residents who had gathered to watch the excitement. "Stay close," he instructed. "Act natural. We're just 2 people walking to our car." The advice was easier to give than follow. Every step felt conspicuous. Every passerby seemed to stare at them with suspicious eyes. Scarlett had removed her sunglasses and tucked them into her blazer pocket, but the auburn wig remained in place. Jake hoped it would be enough to fool casual observation. They'd made it halfway to the Ford Explorer when Jake spotted Sheriff Rodriguez positioned at the intersection of Main and 3rd Streets, directing traffic around the emergency vehicles. The sheriff's attention was focused on his radio communications, but his position gave him a clear view of anyone approaching the bank area. "Problem," Jake murmured. Scarlett followed his gaze and immediately understood the situation. Rodriguez wasn't just managing the scene, he was creating a checkpoint, screening everyone who entered or left the immediate area around the bank. Getting to the rental car would require walking directly past someone trained to identify suspicious behavior. "Alternative plan?" she asked. Jake's mind raced through possibilities, discarding options as quickly as he considered them. They could wait for Rodriguez to move, but that might take hours they didn't have. They could try a different route, but all roads leading away from downtown would funnel them through similar choke points, or they could commit to the audacious approach he'd suggested earlier. "We walk straight past him," Jake decided. "I show my badge, tell him I'm conducting interviews related to the investigation. You're a witness I'm escorting to my vehicle for a more detailed statement." The plan relied entirely on Jake's federal credentials and Rodriguez's assumption that FBI agents knew what they were doing. It was a massive gamble, but every alternative seemed even riskier. "What if he asks for details about my statement? Then you tell him exactly what happened, just from a different perspective." Scarlett looked confused until Jake explained his reasoning. She had witnessed the bank robbery just from the inside rather than the outside. Her knowledge of the events was firsthand and accurate. She simply wouldn't mention her role as the perpetrator rather than an observer. Sometimes the best lies were built on foundations of truth. They resumed walking toward the intersection, their pace casual but purposeful. Jake straightened his tie and adopted the confident demeanor he'd cultivated during years of federal investigations. Scarlett matched his stride, her posture suggesting someone cooperating with law enforcement rather than fleeing from it. "Sheriff." Rodriguez looked up from his radio as they approached. His eyes registered Jake's professional appearance, the federal credentials Jake displayed prominently, and Scarlett's nervous but compliant behavior. Everything fit the pattern Rodriguez would expect to see during a multi-agency investigation. "Agent Sullivan," Jake introduced himself. "I'm coordinating witness interviews for the federal assessment. This is Ms. Davis, one of the customers who was inside the bank during the incident." Rodriguez nodded acknowledgement, his attention already shifting back to his radio communications. The introduction was routine enough to avoid suspicion, official enough to discourage questions. "Any leads on the suspect?" Jake asked, maintaining his cover while gathering intelligence about the investigation's progress. "Female, mid-20s, dark hair under a disguise," Rodriguez replied. "Took approximately $300,000 from the vault. Clean operation, no violence, in and out in under 4 minutes. Professional job." The assessment was both accurate and troubling. If Rodriguez suspected they were dealing with a professional criminal, the response would escalate quickly. Federal resources, specialized tracking units, possibly even air support within hours. Any surveillance footage? Jake pressed. Security cameras caught her entering and leaving, but the disguise makes identification difficult. We're hoping witness statements will provide better details. Rodriguez's gaze shifted to Scarlett, expectant. This was the moment when their deception would either succeed completely or collapse catastrophically. I was making a deposit when she approached the counter. Scarlett began, her voice steady despite the circumstances. She seemed nervous, kept looking around like she was expecting something to happen. When she handed Jennifer the note, I knew something was wrong. The statement was technically accurate, while omitting crucial details about Scarlett's identity and motivations. Rodriguez nodded, apparently satisfied with the information. Agent Sullivan will take your complete statement, he told Scarlett. We appreciate your cooperation. They walked the remaining block to the Ford Explorer in relative silence, both aware that their performance had bought them temporary freedom, but not permanent safety. Jake unlocked the vehicle with hands that remained steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. Where to? He asked as they settled into the front seats. Scarlett looked through the windshield at the streets she'd known her entire life, the buildings that had witnessed her childhood and adolescence and the gradual erosion of every dream she'd ever harbored. Cedar Falls had been a prison long before she'd committed any crime worthy of actual imprisonment. Anywhere but here, she said, echoing her earlier response in the alley. Jake started the engine and pulled smoothly into traffic. Just another federal agent conducting routine business in a small Montana town. In the rearview mirror, he could see the organized chaos of the continuing investigation, officers and emergency vehicles and curious residents all participating in a drama whose resolution was far from certain. As they drove past the town limit sign, Scarlett reached into the canvas bag and withdrew a single $100 bill. She held it up to the light, streaming through the passenger window, studying the intricate patterns and security features, as if seeing currency for the first time. $347,000, she said quietly. That's what I thought my freedom was worth. Jake glanced at her profile, noting the way afternoon sunlight caught the auburn strands of her wig and cast shadows across her cheekbones. What do you think it's worth now? Scarlett folded the bill carefully and returned it to the bag, then looked directly at him with an expression that managed to be both vulnerable and determined. I have no idea, she admitted. But I guess we're about to find out. 43 miles northeast of Cedar Falls, Jake pulled the Ford Explorer into an abandoned gas station that had been closed since the interstate bypass redirected traffic away from Highway 191. Weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete, and faded lottery advertisements still clung to windows that hadn't been cleaned in years. The place felt forgotten by time, invisible to anyone who might be looking for them. We need to ditch this car, Jake said, killing the engine. By now they'll have the plates, probably a BOLO alert issued to every law enforcement agency in 3 states. Scarlett studied the desolate landscape surrounding them, rolling hills covered in prairie grass, distant mountains that promised both beauty and isolation. They hadn't passed another vehicle in 20 minutes, which meant they were either safely beyond the search perimeter or heading deeper into terrain where help would be impossible to find. What's our next move? She asked. Jake reached into the glove compartment and withdrew a folded road map, the kind that had become obsolete in the age of GPS navigation. But obsolete meant untraceable, and untraceable meant invisible to the digital surveillance systems that could track their movements through cell phone towers and satellite connections. There's a truck stop called Big Mike's about 60 miles northwest of here, he said, spreading the map across the dashboard. Truckers, travelers, people who pay cash and don't ask questions. We find someone heading north toward Canada and convince them to give us a ride. The plan was simple enough to work, provided they could reach Big Mike's without being intercepted. Jake's federal credentials had gotten them past Sheriff Rodriguez, but that deception had a limited shelf life. Eventually, someone would run his identification number through the system and discover that Agent Jake Sullivan was supposed to be conducting bank assessments, not escorting robbery suspects across state lines. "How long before they figure out what you've done?" Scarlett asked, as if reading his thoughts. "Standard protocol requires agents to check in every 4 hours during field operations. My next scheduled contact is at 6 p.m. Jake checked his watch. 4:17 p.m. After that, they'll start asking questions. Less than 2 hours to disappear completely. The timeline was tight but manageable, assuming everything went according to plan. Jake had learned not to make that assumption about anything, especially plans involving federal fugitives and stolen money. Scarlett pulled off the auburn wig and shook out her natural black hair, which fell in waves past her shoulders. The transformation was startling without the disguise. She looked younger, more vulnerable, but also more authentically herself. Jake found himself staring until she noticed his attention. "Better?" she asked. "Different," he replied, which was true in more ways than she probably realized. They abandoned the Ford Explorer behind the gas station and began walking northwest along a gravel road that paralleled Highway 191. The afternoon sun beat down on the asphalt, creating heat shimmer that made the distant mountains dance like mirages. Their footsteps crunched rhythmically on loose stones, the only sound in a landscape that felt empty of human presence. "Tell me about your family," Jake said after they'd walked in silence for nearly a mile. The request seemed to surprise Scarlett. "Why?" "Because in about 36 hours, everything about your life is going to change permanently. I want to know who you were before this happened." Scarlett considered this explanation while they navigated around a pothole large enough to swallow a small car. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of memories that had been carefully stored away, protected from the daily grind of survival. "My father was a copper miner," she began. "Miguel Martinez, third generation to work the same mine outside Cedar Falls. He used to come home covered in dust, coughing so hard that the walls shook. But he'd still help me with homework every night, never missed a school play or parent conference." Jake could picture it, a man who sacrificed his health to provide for his family, who found joy in his daughter's achievements despite his own physical exhaustion. The kind of father who represented everything good about working-class values. The mine had safety violations dating back 20 years, Scarlett continued. Inadequate ventilation, outdated equipment, corners cut to maximize profits. Everyone knew it was dangerous, but jobs were scarce and families needed income. The familiar story of corporate negligence and worker exploitation. Jake had investigated similar cases during his early years with the Bureau, before he'd been promoted to higher profile assignments that took him away from the communities where justice mattered most. "He died when a support beam failed in Section C," Scarlett said. "Crushed instantly, according to the coroner. The mining company paid for the funeral and offered my mother a settlement of $50,000 in exchange for waiving her right to sue." Jake felt anger building in his chest, the same righteous fury that had driven him to become a federal agent in the first place. Corporate executives who valued profit margins over human lives, lawyers who manipulated grieving families into accepting inadequate compensation, a system that consistently failed the people it was supposed to protect. "She took the money?" he asked. She was 34 years old with a 12-year-old daughter and no job skills beyond raising a family. $50,000 seemed like a fortune compared to the nothing we'd have otherwise. The pragmatic choice, the rational decision under impossible circumstances. Jake understood why Scarlett's mother had accepted the settlement, even as he recognized the injustice of a system that forced such choices on vulnerable people. The money lasted 2 years, Scarlett continued. Medical bills from my father's final months, mortgage payments, basic living expenses. When it ran out, my mother started taking prescription pain medication to cope with the grief. Within 6 months, she was addicted. They'd reached the crest of a small hill that offered a panoramic view of the surrounding countryside. Miles of open grassland stretched in every direction, broken only by occasional clusters of cottonwood trees that marked the locations of hidden creeks. The vastness felt both liberating and intimidating. I dropped out of community college to work full-time, Scarlett said. 3 jobs cleaning offices at night, waiting tables during lunch hours, stocking shelves at the grocery store on weekends. Everything I earned went to keeping the house and buying pills. The mathematics of desperation, where every dollar was calculated against survival needs and human dignity, became a luxury no one could afford. Jake had seen similar stories countless times. Families trapped in cycles of poverty and addiction that seemed impossible to break. For 6 years, I watched her disappear a little more each day. The woman who used to read me bedtime stories and help me build science fair projects became someone I barely recognized. Someone who would steal from my purse to buy drugs, who would lie about doctor appointments that were really visits to dealers. Jake heard the pain in Scarlett's voice. The accumulated weight of watching someone you love destroy themselves while feeling powerless to intervene. He'd carried similar burdens during his own childhood, though the specific circumstances had been different. She overdosed 3 months ago, Scarlett concluded. Fentanyl-laced pills she bought from a dealer who didn't care about dosage or purity. I found her on the kitchen floor when I came home from my shift at the diner. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place for Jake. Scarlett hadn't robbed the bank for luxury or adventure. She'd done it to escape a life that had systematically stripped away everything she'd ever valued. The $300,000 represented freedom from a place where memories of loss overshadowed any possibility of hope. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it completely. The funeral costs wiped out what little savings I had left. The house went into foreclosure last month. I was facing eviction, unemployment, and the prospect of starting over with nothing in a town where everyone knew my story. They'd begun descending the far side of the hill, following the gravel road toward what Jake hoped would be their salvation. In the distance, he could see the geometric shapes of buildings that might be Big Mike's truck stop, though they were still too far away to be certain. "So you planned the perfect crime," Jake observed. "I planned an escape route," Scarlett corrected. "The money was just a means to an end. I needed enough cash to disappear completely, to become someone else, somewhere else." Jake understood the distinction. She wasn't a career criminal motivated by greed or excitement. She was someone who'd been backed into a corner by circumstances beyond her control, who'd chosen desperation over surrender. "Where were you planning to go?" "Vancouver, initially. Far enough from Montana to feel safe, close enough to drive without flying or using credit cards. After that, maybe Europe. Somewhere I could reinvent myself completely." The plan had obvious flaws. Maintaining a false identity required specialized knowledge and resources that most people didn't possess. But Jake also recognized that Scarlett had been operating from a position of complete desperation, where any plan seemed better than accepting defeat. "What about you?" Scarlett asked, turning the conversation back to his motivations. "You threw away a federal career to help someone you met an hour ago. That doesn't seem like rational behavior." Jake laughed, surprising himself with the sound. "Nothing about today qualifies as rational behavior." They'd reached the bottom of the hill where the gravel road intersected with a paved county highway. Signs indicated that Big Mike's truck stop was 8 miles to the northwest, which meant they'd been walking in the right direction. The realization provided a small measure of relief in what had become an increasingly uncertain situation. "But you're right," Jake continued. "Helping you escape doesn't make sense from any logical perspective. I'm risking everything I've worked for, everything I've built over the past 12 years. So why are you doing it? The question forced Jake to confront motivations he'd been avoiding since their encounter in the alley. Why had he chosen to help Scarlett instead of arresting her? What was it about her situation that resonated so strongly with his own experiences? Because I understand what it's like to feel trapped, he said finally. To wake up every morning in a life that doesn't feel like your own, going through motions that stopped making sense years ago. The admission felt dangerous, more revealing than anything he'd shared with colleagues or friends, or the women he'd dated sporadically over the years. But something about their shared flight from the law had created an intimacy that made honesty feel both necessary and inevitable. My father was a police officer in Detroit, Jake began. 26 years on the force, decorated veteran, respected by everyone in the department. He was also an alcoholic who beat my mother regularly and taught me that authority meant the right to hurt people weaker than yourself. Scarlett listened without judgment, understanding that his confession represented a balance to her own revelations about family trauma and systemic failure. I joined the FBI to prove I was different, to use authority to protect people instead of victimizing them. For years, that mission felt meaningful. I was making a difference, helping victims, stopping predators. The road ahead curved through a stand of aspen trees whose leaves were just beginning to show, the gold edges that promised autumn's arrival. Soon, the temperatures would drop and snow would make travel through this region dangerous for anyone without proper equipment and shelter. Then I encountered a system that protected the powerful and sacrificed the vulnerable, and I realized I'd been naive about the nature of justice in America. Jake described the human trafficking case in more detail, explaining how political connections had corrupted what should have been a straightforward prosecution. He told Scarlett about the victims he'd interviewed, teenagers who'd been promised legitimate jobs and instead found themselves enslaved by networks that operated with virtual impunity. 37 people, he repeated. All because someone made a phone call to someone else who valued political favors more than human lives. They'd reached the truck stop, which turned out to be exactly what Jake had hoped for, a collection of weathered buildings surrounding a parking lot filled with 18-wheelers, RVs, and the kind of older vehicles that suggested their owners lived on society's margins. The perfect place for two federal fugitives to find anonymous transportation. So we're both running away from systems that failed us, Scarlett observed. Looks that way. They surveyed the truck stop from a distance, identifying potential allies and threats among the people moving between vehicles and buildings. Jake's law enforcement training helped him assess which truckers might be sympathetic to travelers needing rides, which ones might ask uncomfortable questions or demand identification. There, he said, pointing to a blue Peterbilt with Alberta license plates. Canadian trucker heading home. Probably sympathetic to people with immigration issues, less likely to contact American authorities. The plan was simple. Approach the driver, offer cash for passage to the border, rely on the informal economy that existed in places like Big Mike's where transactions happened without paperwork or official oversight. How much do we offer? Scarlett asked, reaching for the canvas bag. Enough to make it worth his while, not so much that it seemed suspicious. Maybe $500. Scarlett counted out the bills while Jake approached the Peterbilt's driver, a bearded man in his 50s who was conducting a pre-trip inspection of his trailer. The negotiation took less than 5 minutes. The driver was indeed heading to Calgary, was willing to take passengers for the right price, and had no interest in their reasons for needing the ride. Names are Tom and Sarah, Jake told Scarlett as they climbed into the truck's sleeper compartment. We're newlyweds heading to Canada for our honeymoon. Keep the story simple. The truck's engine rumbled to life, and Big Mike's truck stop began to recede in the side mirrors. Within minutes, they were traveling north on Highway 2. Eating up miles that put increasing distance between them and the crime scene in Cedar Falls. Tom and Sarah, Scarlett repeated, testing the false identities. How long have we been married? 3 days, Jake replied. Just long enough to explain why we're still figuring each other out. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. They were pretending to be newlyweds, while their actual relationship consisted of barely 4 hours of shared criminal activity and mutual confessions about personal trauma. Yet somehow, the deception felt more authentic than most of the relationships Jake had attempted over the years. As the Peterbilt CB radio crackled with trucker communications about traffic conditions and weather reports, Scarlett settled against Jake's shoulder and closed her eyes. For the first time since morning, she looked peaceful, unburdened by the constant vigilance that had defined her life in Cedar Falls. "Jake," she murmured. "Yeah? When we get to Canada, what happens then?" The question addressed the uncertainty that had been growing with every mile they traveled. Their escape had been successful so far, but escape was only the beginning. Eventually, they would need to decide who they wanted to become, both individually and together. "I don't know," Jake admitted, but for the first time in years, not knowing feels like freedom instead of failure. Scarlett smiled without opening her eyes, and Jake realized that whatever happened next, this moment sitting in a truck's sleeper compartment with a woman who'd robbed a bank and stolen, his certainty about right and wrong represented the first honest choice he'd made in longer than he could remember. The road stretched ahead toward Canada, toward uncertainty, toward possibilities that hadn't existed when the day began. Behind them, Cedar Falls continued its search for criminals who were already becoming different people, outlaws in ways that transcended any legal definition of the term. The truck driver, who'd introduced himself only as Earl, pulled into a 24-hour diner 12 miles south of the Canadian border at 11:47 p.m. Neon signs advertising coffee and pie cast red and blue shadows across the parking lot, where a handful of vehicles suggested other travelers making late-night journeys through the northern Montana wilderness. "This is where we part ways," Earl announced, his voice carrying the fatigue of someone who'd been driving for 14 straight hours. "Border crossing gets complicated with passengers who don't have proper documentation. Nothing personal." Jake understood the trucker's position. Earl had already taken significant risks, transporting 2 strangers who'd paid cash and offered minimal information about their background. Asking him to navigate international customs with potentially undocumented passengers would be pushing his generosity beyond reasonable limits. "We appreciate the ride," Jake said, climbing down from the sleeper compartment. "You've been more helpful than you know." Scarlett gathered the canvas bag and followed Jake into the diner's parking lot, where the temperature had dropped to somewhere near freezing. Her breath created small clouds in the crisp air as she surveyed their surroundings, taking inventory of potential transportation options and exit strategies. The diner itself was a classic roadside establishment that probably hadn't been renovated since the 1970s. Vinyl booths, fluorescent lighting, and the kind of all-night atmosphere that attracted insomniacs, shift workers, and people traveling at odd hours for reasons they preferred not to discuss. "We need new identification," Jake said as they walked toward the building. "Crossing the border as Tom and Sarah requires documentation that we don't have." The challenge was significant, but not insurmountable. Jake's federal training had included courses on document forgery and identity verification, knowledge that was supposed to help him detect fraudulent papers during investigations. Those same skills could be applied in reverse, provided they could find the right resources. "How do we get fake IDs at midnight in the middle of nowhere?" Scarlett asked. "We don't," Jake replied. "We find real IDs that belong to people who won't miss them for a few hours." The plan was ethically questionable, but practically sound. Every year, thousands of legitimate travelers cross the U.S.-Canada border with minimal scrutiny, especially those who appeared to be tourists or business travelers. Jake and Scarlett could potentially pass for a couple returning from a vacation, provided they had documentation that matched their physical descriptions. Inside the diner, they claimed. A corner booth that offered clear views of both entrances and began studying the other customers. Most were solitary travelers, truckers grabbing coffee between shifts, late-night workers heading home, a few people who looked like they might be experiencing personal crises that required geographic solutions, but at a table near the windows. Jake spotted exactly what they needed. A couple in their 20s or early 30s, obviously exhausted from long-distance travel, with a collection of bags and documents spread across their table. The woman had dark hair similar to Scarlett's, while the man was roughly Jake's height and build. Honeymooners, Scarlett observed, following his gaze. Coming back from Banff or Jasper, probably. The couple was deep in conversation about their travel plans, consulting maps and guidebooks while sorting through what appeared to be receipts and documentation from their trip. Perfect targets for a temporary identity theft that would go unnoticed until they reached the border crossing. "Order coffee and pie," Jake instructed. "Act like we're discussing our own travel plans. I'll handle the rest." Jake approached the counter and struck up a conversation with the night shift waitress, a woman named Dolores who'd probably been working at the diner since the Carter administration. He explained that he and his wife were returning from their honeymoon in Canada, that they'd had a wonderful time but were eager to get home to Montana. The story served two purposes. It established their cover story for anyone who might be listening, and it provided Jake with intelligence about the other couple's situation. Dolores confirmed that the young man and woman were indeed returning from a Canadian vacation, that they'd been discussing their border crossing strategy, and that they seemed nervous about the customs process. "First time crossing back," Dolores explained. "Sweet kids, but they don't know what to expect." Perfect. Nervous first-time border crossers would be easily distracted, especially if someone appeared to be helping them navigate the process. Jake returned to their booth and outlined his plan to Scarlett. They would offer to share a taxi to the border crossing, claiming that their rental car had broken down and stranded them at the diner. During the ride, Jake would create an opportunity to temporarily acquire the couple's identification documents, use them to cross the border, then return them through a method that wouldn't expose their theft. "What if they notice their IDs are missing before we can return them?" Scarlett asked. "Then we improvise," Jake replied. But people rarely check their documentation during short taxi rides, especially when they're tired and distracted. The approach required precise timing and psychological manipulation, skills that Jake had developed during undercover operations, but had never applied to criminal activities. The irony of using federal training to commit federal crimes wasn't lost on him. At 12:30 a.m., Jake approached the young couple's table and introduced himself as Tom, explaining that he and his wife Sarah were stranded without transportation to the border crossing. Would they be interested in sharing the cost of a taxi ride? The young man, who introduced himself as David, seemed relieved to have experienced travelers to share the journey. His girlfriend Lisa was clearly nervous about the border crossing process and welcomed Jake's apparent knowledge of customs procedures. "We've never crossed an international border before," David admitted. "Any advice about what to expect?" Jake provided reassuring guidance about customs interviews, explaining that border agents typically asked routine questions about the purpose and duration of visits, that having proper documentation was more important than perfect answers, and that appearing calm and confident was the best strategy for avoiding secondary screening. The taxi arrived 15 minutes later, driven by a man who looked like he'd been making late-night border runs for decades. Jake and Scarlett climbed into the front seats while David and Lisa settled in the back, their nervousness increasing as they got closer to the international crossing. "First time crossing?" the taxi driver asked, recognizing the signs of border anxiety. "For them," Jake replied, gesturing toward the back seat. "My wife and I do this trip regularly for business." The fabrication served to reinforce Jake's credibility as someone who understood border procedures, making David and Lisa more likely to trust his guidance and less likely to question his actions. As they approached the border crossing, Jake turned to face the young couple and offered to review their documentation, explaining that border agents sometimes rejected passports that appeared damaged or illegible. The gesture seemed helpful, protective, exactly what nervous first-time travelers would want from experienced guides. David handed over both passports without hesitation, grateful for Jake's assistance. Lisa added their return tickets and hotel receipts, everything organized in a clear plastic folder that made the temporary theft almost embarrassingly easy. Jake examined the documents with the thoroughness of someone conducting a genuine inspection, memorizing details while appearing to check for potential problems. David Chun, age 28, from Seattle. Lisa Park, age 26, also from Seattle. Both documents were in excellent condition. Both photos were reasonable matches for Jake and Scarlett's general appearance. "Everything looks perfect," Jake announced, returning the documents to David's relieved hands. "You shouldn't have any problems." But during the exchange, Jake had palmed Lisa's passport with the sleight-of-hand techniques he'd learned during an undercover operation involving counterfeit document networks. The maneuver was invisible to anyone not specifically watching for it, completed in a few seconds when David was distracted by Lisa's questions about customs procedures. The taxi reached the border crossing at 1:15 a.m., where the late-night shift created an atmosphere of routine efficiency rather than heightened scrutiny. A handful of vehicles waited in the inspection lanes, most containing travelers who looked as tired as Jake and Scarlett felt. "This is where we get out," Jake announced, handing cash to the taxi driver. "David, Lisa, you've got this. Just remember what we talked about." They climbed out of the taxi and walked toward the customs building, leaving the young couple to continue their journey through the proper inspection lanes. Jake hoped their crossing would go smoothly, that their missing passport wouldn't be discovered until David and Lisa were safely across the border. "U.S. Customs and Border Protection," the agent announced as Jake and Scarlett approached the inspection window. "Purpose of your visit to Canada?" "Honeymoon," Jake replied, displaying David's passport while Scarlett presented Lisa's document. "We spent a week in the Canadian Rockies." The agent, a middle-aged woman who looked like she'd processed thousands of similar crossings, examined their documentation with professional thoroughness. She compared the passport photos to their faces, checked the entry stamps, ran their names through computer databases that Jake hoped wouldn't reveal any complications. "How long were you in Canada?" the agent asked. 7 days, Scarlett replied. "We visited Banff, Lake Louise, and Calgary." Standard tourist destinations, exactly what the agent would expect from American honeymooners visiting the Canadian Rockies. The agent nodded, continued her inspection, apparently satisfied with their responses. "Any purchases or acquisitions while in Canada that you're declaring?" "Just souvenirs," Jake said. "Nothing that requires declaration." The agent handed back their passports and waved them through the inspection checkpoint. "Welcome home." They walked through the customs area and out into the American side of the border crossing, where a parking lot offered rental car agencies, taxi services, and bus connections to major cities throughout the northern United States. After 18 hours of uncertainty and improvisation, they had successfully crossed an international border using stolen identities. "Now what?" Scarlett asked, surveying their options for continued travel. Jake was already walking toward a 24-hour car rental counter where a tired-looking clerk was processing paperwork for late-night customers. Renting a vehicle would require identification and a credit card, resources they didn't legitimately possess. But Jake had an idea that might solve both problems. "We need a car," he told the clerk, a young man whose name tag identified him as Marcus, something reliable for a long-distance drive. Marcus began the standard rental process, requesting identification and payment information. Jake produced David's passport and explained that his credit cards were in his luggage, which had been delayed during their border crossing. Would cash be acceptable as payment, along with a substantial security deposit? The explanation was plausible, enough to avoid suspicion, especially at a border crossing where luggage delays and documentation complications were routine occurrences. Marcus accepted $2,000 in cash as payment and deposit for a white Ford Escape, processing the paperwork with the efficiency of someone who'd handled similar situations before. Within 30 minutes, they were driving south on Interstate 15, putting distance between themselves and the border crossing where David and Lisa would eventually discover their missing passport. Jake hoped the young couple would assume they'd misplaced the document rather than recognizing they'd been victims of theft. "Where are we heading?" Scarlett asked as they passed through the outskirts of Great Falls, Montana. Jake consulted the road atlas he'd purchased at the border crossing, studying routes that would take them away from areas where law enforcement might be searching for federal fugitives. The investigation in Cedar Falls would have expanded by now, probably involving multiple agencies and sophisticated tracking resources. Denver, he decided. Large enough city to disappear in, far enough from Montana to be outside the immediate search area. We can establish new identities, plan our next moves. The drive to Denver would take approximately 8 hours, assuming they maintained legal speeds and avoided attention from highway patrol officers. Jake planned to alternate driving duties with Scarlett, allowing each of them to rest while the other maintained their southward progress. As they settled into the rhythm of highway travel, Scarlett reached into the canvas bag and withdrew a packet of bills, counting them systematically in the dashboard light. Her expression grew troubled as she reviewed the totals. "We've spent almost $15,000 since leaving Cedar Falls," she announced. "Trucker payment, rental car, cash deposits, taxi fees. At this rate, the money won't last as long as I'd hoped." The financial reality was sobering but not unexpected. Living as fugitives required cash for everything, eliminating the cost efficiencies of credit cards and electronic payments. Every transaction carried premium pricing. Every service provider demanded immediate payment without the protections of formal contracts. "How much do we have left?" Jake asked. "About $320,000. Enough to live comfortably for several years, if we're careful about expenses. Or enough to disappear permanently, if they were willing to accept modest lifestyles. In places where American dollars provided significant purchasing power." Jake had investigated enough international financial crimes to understand the economics of expatriate living. The countries where cash could buy anonymity and Western currency could provide comfortable retirement. "Mexico," Scarlett said, apparently following similar lines of thinking. "Or maybe Costa Rica. Somewhere warm, where $300,000 could last decades." The suggestion had obvious appeal: tropical climates, friendly populations, governments that didn't always cooperate fully with American law enforcement agencies. But Jake also recognized the challenges of permanent exile, the psychological costs of never being able to return home or contact family and friends. "Is that what you want?" he asked. "Permanent exile?" Scarlett considered the question while watching the landscape roll past their windows. Mountains gave way to plains, darkness punctuated by the occasional lights of isolated ranch houses and small towns that most Americans never visited. "I want to wake up tomorrow morning without being afraid," she said finally. "Whether that happens in Costa Rica or Colorado doesn't matter as much as the feeling itself." Jake understood exactly what she meant. Fear had been his constant companion for months: fear of corruption, fear of institutional failure, fear that his work no longer served any meaningful purpose. The past 24 hours represented the first time in years that he'd acted according to his own moral compass rather than bureaucratic requirements. "Then we'll find a place where you can feel safe," he promised. The commitment surprised them both with its implications. Jake realized he was thinking in terms of we rather than I, planning a shared future with someone he'd known for less than a day. But their criminal partnership had created an intimacy that transcended normal relationship timelines, forging bonds through shared risk and mutual dependence. "What about you?" Scarlett asked. "What do you want?" Jake drove in silence for several miles, considering the question seriously. For years, his identity had been defined by his federal career. His sense of purpose derived from institutional authority and professional achievements. Abandoning that identity meant confronting fundamental questions about who he was beyond his badge and credentials. "I want to help people again," he said eventually. "Not through government agencies or official channels, but directly. One person at a time." The answer felt honest in a way that surprised him. Jake realized that helping Scarlett escape had provided more satisfaction than any case he'd closed during his final months with the Bureau. There was something pure about individual assistance, uncontaminated by bureaucratic politics or institutional priorities. "We could do that together," Scarlett suggested. "Use the money to help other people who need escape routes, new identities, fresh starts." The idea had romantic appeal, two outlaws using stolen bank funds to assist other victims of systemic injustice. Robin Hood and Maid Marian for the modern era, stealing from institutional wealth to provide individual freedom. But Jake also recognized the practical challenges of such an enterprise. Helping fugitives required specialized knowledge, reliable networks, and constant vigilance against law enforcement infiltration. It was the kind of operation that attracted both genuine victims and dangerous criminals, making moral distinctions increasingly difficult to maintain. "One step at a time," he counseled. "First we establish our own safety, then we decide how to use what we've gained." As dawn approached, they stopped for gas and coffee at a truck stop outside Billings, Montana. The morning news was playing on a television above the coffee station, and Jake felt his blood freeze as he recognized the lead story. "Federal manhunt intensifies for bank robbery suspects," the anchor announced. "FBI agent Jake Sullivan and accomplice Scarlett Martinez are wanted in connection with yesterday's robbery of First National Bank in Cedar Falls, Montana." Their photos filled the screen. Jake's official bureau portrait and what appeared to be a driver's license photo of Scarlett. The images were clear enough to be recognizable to anyone who looked closely, which meant their window of anonymity was closing rapidly. "Authorities consider both suspects armed and extremely dangerous," the anchor continued. "Anyone with information about their whereabouts is urged to contact federal law enforcement immediately." Jake and Scarlett exchanged glances across the coffee station, both understanding that their situation had become exponentially more dangerous. They were no longer anonymous fugitives. They were named suspects in a federal manhunt that would mobilize resources across multiple states. "Time to go," Jake murmured. They paid for their coffee and returned to the rental car, where Jake immediately began planning route modifications that would take them away from major highways and population centers. The Ford Escape that had seemed like salvation an hour earlier now felt like a liability. Its license plates and rental documentation, linking them to identities that law enforcement could track as they drove away from the truck stop. Scarlett reached across the console and took Jake's hand. Her fingers interlaced with his naturally, as if they'd been holding hands for years rather than hours. "No matter what happens next," she said, "I'm glad we're in this together." Jake squeezed her hand and realized that despite the manhunt, despite the uncertain future, despite the fact that they were now the subjects of a federal investigation, he felt the same way. For the first time in his adult life, he was exactly where he belonged, with exactly the right person, doing exactly what felt necessary, even if it meant spending the rest of his life as an outlaw. I've created part 5 of your story, focusing on their transformation from fugitives into activists. This section shows them hiding in an abandoned mine while developing a plan to return the stolen Money along with comprehensive documentation exposing the systematic injustices that led to Scarlett's desperate action. The story evolves their relationship from survival partnership to revolutionary collaboration as they decide to challenge the systems that created their situation rather than simply hiding from the consequences. Their underground hideout becomes a headquarters for investigative work that exposes corporate negligence and government corruption. I've maintained the character development while introducing new stakes. They're no longer just evading capture, but actively working to expose truth that powerful interests want hidden. The section ends with them committed to becoming whistleblowers and activists, setting up Part 6 for the climax of their transformation. Would you like me to continue with Part 6, or would you prefer any adjustments to this section? The encrypted phone Jake had purchased from a black market electronics dealer in Helena buzzed at 3:17 a.m., jolting both of them awake in their underground camp. Only 3 people had the number 2 investigative journalists and a documentary filmmaker who specialized in exposing corporate corruption. A call could mean breakthrough or betrayal. "This is Marcus Chun from the Washington Herald." The voice was tense, urgent. "I've verified everything in your documentation. The mining company, the safety violations, the regulatory capture. It's all true. But there's something else you need to know." Jake activated the call recording feature while Scarlett leaned closer to hear every word. Chun's reputation for accuracy had made him their primary media contact, but his tone suggested complications they hadn't anticipated. The mining company that killed Scarlett's father? Phoenix Mining Corporation? They're a subsidiary of Consolidated Resource Holdings, which is owned by a private equity firm called Meridian Capital Partners. The corporate structure wasn't surprising. Most mining operations used complex ownership arrangements to limit liability and avoid accountability. But Chun's emphasis suggested deeper significance that Jake couldn't immediately grasp. Meridian Capital Partners is controlled by Senator Patricia Williamson, Chun continued. She's used her position on the Senate Energy Committee to block mining safety legislation, while her investment portfolio benefits from reduced regulatory oversight. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Senator Williamson was a prominent political figure who'd built her career on advocating for working families and corporate accountability. Her public image as a champion of labor rights was apparently a facade that concealed financial interests in the very industry she was supposed to regulate. "There's more," Chun said. "Williamson's chief of staff, David Hartwell, has been coordinating with FBI leadership to ensure your case receives maximum prosecution resources. He's personally called Director Morrison 3 times in the past week, demanding aggressive pursuit." Jake felt ice forming in his chest as the implications became clear. The federal manhunt wasn't just about capturing bank robbers, it was about silencing people who possessed documentation that could destroy a senator's career and expose systematic corruption at the highest levels of government. "They know what you've discovered," Chun explained. "Williamson's office has been monitoring federal investigation communications, tracking your progress through unofficial channels. They're treating this as a national security threat." Scarlett grabbed Jake's arm, her fingers digging into his skin with desperate intensity. They'd assumed they were fugitives from justice, but they'd actually become targets of a cover-up operation designed to protect political and financial interests, worth hundreds of millions of dollars. "How do they know what we've found?" Jake asked. "Because I wasn't the only journalist you contacted," Chun replied. "Rebecca Torres from Channel 7? She's been feeding information to Williamson's office in exchange for exclusive access to the senator's anti-corruption initiatives. Torres has been playing both sides." The betrayal explained how law enforcement had seemed to anticipate their movements, why the manhunt had intensified beyond normal procedures for bank robbery cases. Rebecca Torres had been providing intelligence that allowed federal resources to be directed specifically toward preventing their story from becoming public. "We're publishing everything tomorrow morning," Chun announced. "Front page, full documentation, corporate connections, regulatory failures, all of it. But you need to understand that publication will trigger immediate retaliation. Williamson has invested too much in keeping this buried." Jake thanked Chun and ended the call, then stared at Scarlett in the LED lantern's glow. Her face reflected the same mixture of vindication and terror that he felt. They'd been right about systematic corruption, but being right had made them targets of forces far more powerful than they'd imagined. "We can't stay here," Scarlett said quietly. Jake agreed. If federal agents were coordinating with Senator Williamson's office, their underground hideout would be compromised within hours of the Herald's publication. They needed to be mobile, unpredictable, capable of surviving in hostile territory where every law enforcement agency would be searching for them. They packed essential supplies and abandoned everything else, including the comfortable camp they'd established over 2 weeks of careful preparation. Within an hour, they were climbing through natural cave passages toward a remote exit that Charlie had described as the back door to nowhere. The exit emerged through a concealed opening in a cliff face overlooking the Yellowstone River, 23 miles from the nearest road. Jake had scouted the location during his surface reconnaissance missions, identifying it as their emergency evacuation route if the mine became compromised. "Where do we go now?" Scarlett asked as they rappelled down the cliff face in pre-dawn darkness. Jake consulted the waterproof map case he'd prepared for exactly this contingency. Their options were limited. Highways would be monitored, airports were impossible, and bus stations were under surveillance. But the Yellowstone River system offered possibilities that might not have occurred to federal tracking teams. "We follow the water," he decided. "Rivers don't have checkpoints." The plan was audacious in its simplicity. They would acquire a small boat, travel downstream through sections of the Yellowstone that were inaccessible to vehicle pursuit, and emerge hundreds of miles away in a different state where the federal presence might be less concentrated. First, they needed to survive until the Herald's publication created enough media attention to provide protective cover. Once their story became public, killing or disappearing them would raise uncomfortable questions about government overreach and corporate influence. They hiked 8 miles along the riverbank before reaching a fishing access area where a collection of small boats suggested recreational use rather than law enforcement presence. Jake selected an aluminum drift boat that appeared seaworthy, but not expensive enough to trigger immediate theft reports. Grand theft auto, bank robbery, federal flight charges, Scarlett observed as they launched the stolen boat into Yellowstone's current. "We're accumulating quite a resume. Whistleblowing, exposing corruption, protecting public safety," Jake countered. "It's all about perspective." The river carried them northeast through a landscape that seemed untouched by human civilization towering. Cliffs, dense forests, wildlife that watched their passage with curious indifference. For several hours, they could almost forget they were federal fugitives floating toward an uncertain future. At 11:30 a.m., Jake's encrypted phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus Chun. "Story published. All hell breaking loose. Senator Williamson's office issuing denials. DOJ opening investigation. You're now material witnesses in a federal corruption case." The transformation was instantaneous and complete. They were no longer criminals fleeing justice. They were witnesses whose testimony could bring down a U.S. senator and expose corruption that reached the highest levels of government. The shift in legal status brought both protection and increased danger. "Material witnesses," Scarlett repeated, testing the phrase. "That sounds almost respectable." Jake wasn't sure respectability was their goal anymore. They'd evolved beyond conventional categories of criminal and victim, outlaw, and law enforcement. They'd become something unique in the American legal system. People whose crimes had exposed larger crimes, whose illegal actions had served legitimate public interests. The boat's AM radio crackled with news coverage that confirmed Shun's assessment. Senator Williamson was holding an emergency press conference. Congressional ethics committees were announcing investigations, and mining safety advocates were calling for immediate regulatory reforms. "This is unprecedented," one commentator observed. Two bank robbers have potentially exposed the largest corruption scandal involving natural resource extraction in decades. But the positive coverage was balanced by official statements that painted Jake and Scarlett as dangerous criminals, whose illegal actions couldn't be justified regardless of what they'd uncovered. FBI Director Morrison held his own press conference, emphasizing that federal fugitives would be captured and prosecuted to the full extent of the law. "The rule of law doesn't contain exceptions for people who disagree with government policy," Morrison declared. "These individuals are wanted for serious federal crimes, and their capture remains our highest priority." The dueling narratives created public confusion about whether Jake and Scarlett were heroes or villains, whistleblowers or terrorists. But the confusion also provided opportunities that hadn't existed when they were simply bank robbers hiding from federal agents. Late that afternoon, they pulled the boat ashore near a remote ranch where cell phone coverage allowed Jake to contact his former partner at the FBI, Agent Sarah Mitchell. The call was risky. Mitchell might be required to report their location, but Jake needed intelligence about federal operations and prosecutorial intentions. "Jesus Christ, Jake," Mitchell's voice carried a mixture of relief and fear. "Half the Bureau is looking for you. The other half is trying to figure out whether you're a criminal or a hero." Jake explained their situation carefully, emphasizing that they'd uncovered evidence of systematic corruption that threatened national security interests. He needed to know whether the Justice Department was treating them as fugitives or potential cooperating witnesses. "It's complicated," Mitchell admitted. "Your case has been transferred to the Public Corruption Unit, which suggests they're taking your allegations seriously. But there's also pressure from congressional leadership to pursue maximum charges, regardless of what you've exposed." The bureaucratic complexity reflected broader political tensions about accountability and institutional authority. Some federal officials wanted to investigate Scarlett's allegations thoroughly, while others viewed any cooperation with federal fugitives as dangerous precedent. "What do you recommend?" Jake asked. "Surrender through a lawyer who specializes in whistleblower protection," Mitchell suggested. "There are procedures for people who've committed crimes while exposing larger crimes. You might qualify for immunity or reduce charges in exchange for testimony." The legal pathway offered hope but no guarantees. Whistleblower protections were inconsistently applied, especially when the exposed corruption involved powerful political figures. Jake and Scarlett could surrender and still face decades in federal prison if political pressure outweighed legal considerations. "We need more insurance," Jake decided after ending the call. Scarlett understood immediately. Their documentation was powerful, but they needed additional leverage to ensure their safety and guarantee that Scarlett's story would continue circulating regardless of what happened to them personally. "Dead man's switch," she suggested. "Documentation that gets released automatically if we're killed or disappeared." Over the next 2 days, they established multiple contingency systems while continuing their journey downstream. They uploaded encrypted files to cloud storage services with time-delayed release mechanisms, arranged for automatic distribution to dozens of journalists if they failed to check in regularly, and created multiple backup systems that would ensure their story survived even if they didn't. The technical preparations were exhausting, but they provided psychological relief that came from knowing their work would outlive any attempts to silence them. Senator Williamson's office could arrange their deaths, but they couldn't prevent the continued exposure of systematic corruption. On their 3rd night on the river, they camped on a sandbar island where the sound of flowing water provided natural protection against electronic surveillance. As they sat beside a small campfire, watching stars appear in the darkening sky, Scarlett asked the question that had been haunting both of them. What kind of life are we going to have after this? Jake considered the question seriously. Even under the best-case scenario immunity for testimony, successful prosecution of corrupt officials, public vindication of their actions, they would never be able to return to their previous lives. Their faces were too recognizable, their story too notorious, their knowledge too dangerous. Maybe that's not the right question, he suggested. Maybe the question is, what kind of life do we want to build from here? Scarlett leaned against his shoulder, and Jake realized that somewhere during their weeks as fugitives, activists and now whistleblowers, they'd fallen in love in ways that transcended their desperate circumstances. Their relationship had been forged through shared danger and mutual dependence, but it had evolved into something that felt sustainable beyond crisis. "I want a life where we help other people avoid what I went through," Scarlett said. "Where we use what we've learned to prevent families from being destroyed by corporate negligence and government corruption." "A foundation," Jake suggested, "funded by the money we're returning, dedicated to supporting families affected by mining, accidents, and other preventable tragedies." The vision felt right in ways that surprised them both. They could transform the stolen bank funds into a legitimate charitable organization, use their notoriety to attract additional donations, and spend their lives advocating for victims of systematic injustice. The Martinez Foundation for Mining. "Safety," Scarlett said, testing the name. "Dedicated to my father's memory and everyone else who died, because profit mattered more than human life." As they refined their plans through whispered conversation beside the dying campfire, Jake realized they were no longer planning escape or survival. They were planning a future that acknowledged their criminal past while building something constructive. From the wreckage of their previous lives, the Yellowstone River continued flowing past their temporary sanctuary, carrying them toward whatever justice or injustice awaited downstream. But for the first time since leaving Cedar Falls, they felt like they were moving toward something rather than simply running away. "Tomorrow we will contact that lawyer Mitchell recommended," Jake decided. "We start the process of surrendering. On our terms, with our conditions, as material witnesses who exposed corruption rather than simple bank robbers seeking lenient treatment." Scarlett nodded agreement, then looked up at the stars that seemed impossibly bright in the wilderness darkness. "Jake, yeah? When we get through this, when the investigations are finished, and the trials are over, and everything is public record, what do you think people will remember about us?" Jake considered her question while listening to the river's constant murmur, thinking about legacy and meaning, and the strange paths that lead people toward defining moments. "I think they'll remember that two people who had every reason to hate the system found a way to make it better," he said finally. "I think they'll remember that love and justice aren't opposites, they're the same thing, expressed through actions that protect other people from unnecessary suffering." Scarlett smiled in the firelight, and Jake knew that whatever happened, next arrest, trial, imprisonment, or freedom, they had already succeeded in the only way that mattered. They had transformed their individual pain into collective action, their personal desperation into public justice. They had become exactly the kind of outlaws the world needed. The federal courthouse in Denver buzzed with an energy that hadn't been seen since the trials of major organized crime figures in the 1980s. Media vans lined the streets for 6 blocks in every direction. Satellite dishes pointed skyward like mechanical flowers tracking the sun. Inside, Courtroom 7A had been transformed into what one journalist called the epicenter of American justice, where two bank robbers would either be condemned as criminals or celebrated as heroes who exposed corruption reaching the highest levels of government. Jake Sullivan adjusted his tie for the 5th time in 10 minutes, the same nervous gesture that had annoyed his federal supervisors during countless depositions over his 12-year career. Today, however, he sat at the defendant's table rather than the prosecution's witness stand. facing charges that could result in life imprisonment or complete exoneration, depending on how 12 ordinary citizens interpreted extraordinary circumstances. All rise for the Honorable Judge Margaret Chun. The bailiff announced. Judge Chun, no relation to the Washington Herald reporter who'd broken their story, had been selected specifically for her reputation as someone who couldn't be influenced by political pressure or media attention. Her rulings during the pretrial hearings had been scrupulously fair, allowing evidence about mining safety corruption while refusing to let the trial become a referendum on corporate malfeasance. "Good morning," Judge Chin said, settling behind the bench with the calm authority of someone who'd overseen hundreds of federal trials. "We're here today for final arguments in United States versus Sullivan and Martinez. Before we proceed, I want to remind everyone that this courtroom will remain orderly regardless of public interest in these proceedings." The warning was directed primarily at the gallery, which contained an unusual mixture of mining safety advocates, federal agents, journalists, and what appeared to be ordinary citizens who'd driven hundreds of miles to witness what many considered the most important trial of the decade. Lead prosecutor Anthony Morrison, chosen despite sharing a surname with the FBI director to avoid any appearance of coordination, rose from the government's table with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a federal case. His opening statement 3 weeks earlier had been a masterpiece of legal logic, acknowledging the defendant's good intentions while emphasizing that noble motivations couldn't justify criminal actions. "Your Honor," Morrison began, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of courtroom authority, "the defendants have spent weeks attempting to transform this trial into something it was never meant to be. They want you to believe this case is about corporate corruption, political influence, and systematic injustice. But the law is clear. This case is about bank robbery, federal flight, and conspiracy to commit multiple felonies." Morrison's closing argument methodically dismantled the defense's narrative, emphasizing that Scarlett Martinez had planned and executed an armed robbery that terrorized bank employees and violated federal statutes, regardless of her personal circumstances. He reminded the jury that Jake Sullivan had sworn an oath to uphold federal law, not to decide which laws deserved enforcement based on his personal judgment. "The defendants want you to believe they're whistleblowers," Morrison continued, "but whistleblowing has established legal procedures that protect people who expose wrongdoing through legitimate channels. Banks have insurance to cover theft. Victims have legal remedies for corporate negligence. The defendants chose criminal action when legal alternatives were available. The prosecution's case was technically sound but emotionally hollow, acknowledging the defendants' discoveries while arguing that criminal methods couldn't be justified by beneficial outcomes." Morrison concluded by reminding the jury that societies collapse when individuals decide which laws apply to their particular circumstances. Defense attorney Rebecca Williams approached the jury with a different energy, entirely not the polished confidence of career prosecutors, but the passionate intensity of someone who believed her clients represented something larger than criminal law. Williams specialized in whistleblower protection and had volunteered to represent Jake and Scarlett pro bono after reading their documentation. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Williams began, "you've heard weeks of testimony about bank robbery procedures and federal statutes. But you've also heard about Miguel Martinez, a copper miner who died because corporate executives valued profit margins more than worker safety. You've heard about Carmen Martinez, a grieving widow who became addicted to prescription medication because she couldn't afford adequate mental health treatment. You've heard about systematic corruption that protected mining companies while sacrificing working families." Williams had structured her defense around a simple premise. Her client's criminal actions had exposed crimes far more serious than bank robbery, and their illegal methods had been necessary because legal channels were controlled by the same corrupt interests they were trying to expose. Senator Patricia Williamson controlled the mining company that killed Miguel Martinez, Williams continued. She used her position on the Senate Energy Committee to block safety legislation while her investment portfolio benefited from reduced regulatory oversight. When my clients discovered this corruption, Williamson's office coordinated with federal law enforcement to silence them through excessive prosecution. The defense strategy was risky, arguing that government corruption justified criminal action, required the jury to accept that established authority could be so compromised that illegal resistance became morally necessary. But 3 weeks of testimony had provided compelling evidence that normal legal procedures would never have exposed Williamson's conflicts of interest. My clients didn't just rob a bank, Williams told the jury. They uncovered a conspiracy that reached the United States Senate, exposed regulatory capture that endangered thousands of workers, and revealed how political influence protects corporate negligence. They committed crimes, yes, but they committed crimes that served the public interest. The courtroom remained silent as Williams outlined the broader implications of the case. If juries could acquit defendants whose illegal actions exposed corruption, it would establish precedent for future civil disobedience. If they convicted whistleblowers who'd used criminal methods, it would signal that institutional authority trumped individual conscience regardless of circumstances. The question before you, Williams concluded, isn't whether my clients broke the law. The question is whether justice requires punishment for people whose crimes protected others from greater harm. Judge Chun called a 2-hour recess before jury deliberations, during which Jake and Scarlett waited in a conference room with their legal team. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of media attention, congressional hearings, and legal proceedings that had transformed them from obscure fugitives into national symbols of resistance against institutional corruption. Senator Williamson had resigned 3 weeks into the FBI's investigation, but not before her Chief of Staff David Hartwell revealed the extent of her coordination with mining interests. Congressional ethics committees had expanded their inquiry to include 12 other senators, whose investment portfolios suggested similar conflicts of interest. The Department of Justice had opened a broad investigation into regulatory capture that threatened to expose decades of systematic corruption. Whatever the jury decides, Williams told them, you've already accomplished more than most whistleblowers achieve in lifetimes of legal advocacy. Scarlett reached for Jake's hand, their fingers interlacing with the natural ease that had developed during months of shared uncertainty. Their relationship had been tested by media scrutiny, legal pressure, and the constant stress of facing potential life sentences, but it had emerged stronger than either had thought possible. Any regrets? Jake asked quietly. Scarlett considered the question seriously. The past year had cost them everything they'd previously understood about their lives' careers. Security, privacy, the possibility of normal futures. But it had also given them purposes that felt more meaningful than anything they'd experienced before. None, she said finally. Even if we spend the rest of our lives in federal prison, what we exposed was worth it. Jake agreed completely. Miguel Martinez's death had meaning now that extended beyond personal tragedy. Carmen Martinez's addiction had become part of a broader narrative about how corporate negligence destroyed families and communities. Scarlett's desperate bank robbery had evolved into evidence of how systematic injustice could drive ordinary people toward extraordinary actions. The Martinez Foundation for Mining Safety had been established using the returned bank funds, along with donations that had poured in from supporters worldwide. The organization was already advocating for families affected by preventable industrial accidents, funding legal challenges to inadequate safety regulations, and documenting corporate negligence that might otherwise remain hidden. At 4:17 p.m., the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict after 3 hours of deliberation. Jake and Scarlett returned to the defendant's table, where Williams attempted to project confidence despite the uncertainty that affected everyone involved in the case. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Chun asked. The jury foreman, a retired high school teacher named Robert Kim, stood with the gravity of someone who understood the historical significance of the moment. We have, Your Honor. On the charge of conspiracy to commit bank robbery, how do you find? We find the defendants guilty. Jake felt Scarlett's hand tighten in his, but her expression remained composed. They'd expected conviction on the technical charges. Their actions clearly violated federal statutes, regardless of their motivations. On the charge of bank robbery, how do you find? We find the defendant Scarlett Martinez guilty. On the charge of aiding and abetting bank robbery, how do you find? We find the defendant Jake Sullivan guilty. The verdicts continued through all 12 charges, each guilty verdict acknowledging that the defendants had indeed committed the crimes as defined by federal law. But Kim's tone suggested something unusual was coming. Your Honor, Kim continued, after the final charge, the jury would like to make a statement regarding our verdicts. Judge Chun looked surprised. Jury statements were unusual in federal criminal cases, but she nodded permission for Kim to continue. We find the defendants guilty of all charges as defined by federal law, Kim read from a prepared statement. However, we want to express our unanimous opinion that their actions served the public interest by exposing corruption that threatened public safety and government integrity. We strongly recommend that Your Honor consider the exceptional circumstances of this case when determining appropriate sentences. The statement was unprecedented in Kim's experience as a federal judge, but it reflected the jury's struggle with convicting defendants whose crimes had clearly benefited society. The 12 citizens had found a way to acknowledge legal guilt, while expressing moral support for the defendant's actions. Thank you, Mr. Kim, Judge Chun said. The jury is dismissed with the court's gratitude for your service. As the jury filed out, Jake realized that their conviction represented a form of victory rather than defeat. 12 ordinary Americans had acknowledged that their crimes served legitimate purposes, creating moral authority that transcended legal technicalities. 3 weeks later, Jake and Scarlett returned to courtroom 7A for sentencing, where Judge Chun would determine whether they faced decades in federal prison or received the lenient treatment recommended by the jury. The intervening weeks had brought additional developments that influenced the case's final resolution. A federal investigation had resulted in indictments against 4 mining company executives, including Phoenix Mining Corporation CEO and Safety Director. Congressional hearings had led to the resignation of 3 senators and the introduction of comprehensive mining safety legislation. The Department of Justice had announced a task force dedicated to investigating regulatory capture across multiple industries. Mr. Sullivan, Ms. Martinez, Judge Chun began. You have been convicted of serious federal crimes that normally result in significant prison sentences. However, this case presents circumstances that require consideration of factors beyond standard sentencing guidelines. Jake and Scarlett stood side by side as Judge Chun outlined the unique elements of their case, the corruption they'd exposed, the public safety benefits of their actions, the jury's recommendation for leniency, and the broader institutional changes that had resulted from their criminal activities. The court finds that your crimes were motivated by desperation rather than greed, that your methods were restrained rather than violent, and that your outcomes served public interests that might not have been achieved through legal channels. Judge Chun continued. While the court cannot endorse criminal action as a solution to institutional failure, the court recognizes that exceptional circumstances sometimes require exceptional responses. The sentencing hearing had attracted even more media attention than the trial, with mining safety advocates filling the gallery alongside federal agents and journalists. Judge Chun's words were being broadcast live to millions of Americans who'd followed the case as a referendum on government accountability and corporate responsibility. Mr. Sullivan, you are sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. with credit for time served and eligibility for parole after 18 months. Miss Martinez, you are sentenced to 3 years in federal prison, with credit for time served and eligibility for parole after 12 months. The sentences were dramatically less than the 25 years to life that prosecutors had originally sought, reflecting Judge Chun's consideration of the exceptional circumstances and the jury's recommendation for leniency. More importantly, the parole eligibility meant that both defendants could be released within a year if they demonstrated continued commitment to legitimate advocacy work. However, Judge Chun continued, the court is also imposing conditions that reflect the unique nature of this case. Both defendants will serve their sentences at a minimum security facility that allows them to continue their work with the Martinez Foundation for Mining Safety. They will be required to participate in restorative justice programs that connect them with victims of corporate negligence, and they will be prohibited from engaging in any illegal advocacy activities. The creative sentencing reflected Judge Chun's understanding that traditional imprisonment would serve no useful purpose for defendants whose crimes had already produced positive social outcomes. Instead, she was structuring punishment that allowed continued legitimate advocacy while acknowledging legal violations. Additionally, Judge Chun concluded, the court is ordering that any future book or media deals regarding this case must donate 50% of proceeds to victims of mining accidents and industrial negligence. The defendant's story has value, but that value should benefit the communities they claim to represent. As court officers prepared to escort them to federal custody, Jake and Scarlett had a few minutes to speak with their families and supporters who'd gathered in the courthouse. Scarlett's Aunt Maria had driven from New Mexico to attend the sentencing, bringing photographs of Miguel and Carmen Martinez that reminded everyone why the case mattered beyond its legal implications. Your parents would be proud, Maria told Scarlett, tears streaming down her face. You turned their tragedy into something that will protect other families. Jake's younger sister Jennifer had flown from Portland, bringing her 2 children who were too young to understand the legal proceedings, but old enough to recognize that their uncle had become someone important. Jake hugged them carefully, understanding that it might be months before he could see them again. Are you going to jail? His 6-year-old nephew asked with the direct curiosity of childhood. For a little while, Jake replied honestly. But sometimes people have to accept consequences for doing what they believe is right. As they were led away in handcuffs, Jake and Scarlett walked past a gallery filled with people whose lives had been touched by their story. Mining safety advocates, victims' families, federal agents who'd investigated their case, journalists who'd covered their trial, and ordinary citizens who'd driven hundreds of miles to witness what many considered a defining moment in American justice. The federal correctional facility in Colorado Springs was unlike anything either had imagined during their months as fugitives. Rather than the fortress-like maximum security prisons featured in movies, their minimum security assignment resembled a college campus with dormitories, educational facilities, and work programs that allowed inmates to maintain connections with the outside world. Jake was assigned to the facility's legal research program, where his federal law enforcement experience helped other inmates navigate appeals and sentence reductions. Scarlett worked in the vocational training department, teaching financial literacy and job skills to women who would soon be returning to communities that offered limited economic opportunities. More importantly, both were allowed to continue their advocacy work through scheduled phone calls and supervised internet access that let them coordinate with the Martinez Foundation's expanding operations. The organization had received over $2 million in donations during the 6 months since their arrest, funding legal support for 43 families affected by preventable industrial accidents. Every evening, they were allowed 1 hour of personal time together in the facility's common area, where they planned foundation activities and discussed the broader implications of their case. Other inmates gradually learned their story, and many sought advice about their own struggles with institutional injustice and systematic oppression. "We've become jailhouse lawyers," Scarlett observed during one of their evening conversations. "We've become what we were always supposed to be," Jake replied. "People who help other people navigate systems that don't care about individual suffering." 8 months into their sentences, they received word that the Foundation's advocacy had contributed to the passage of the Miguel Martinez Mining Safety Act, federal legislation that required independent safety inspections, increased penalties for violations, and established a victim compensation fund for families affected by preventable industrial accidents. The law represented more than policy reform. It transformed personal tragedy into institutional change that would protect thousands of workers whose names would never appear in news headlines. Miguel Martinez's death had meaning that extended far beyond his family's immediate grief. On a cold morning in early December, exactly 11 months after their sentencing, Jake and Scarlett walked through the gates of the federal correctional facility as free citizens. Their parole had been approved based on their exemplary conduct and continued commitment to legitimate advocacy work. Rebecca Williams waited in the parking lot with a van full of Martinez Foundation staff members who'd driven from Denver to celebrate their release. The organization had grown into a nationally recognized advocacy group with offices in 6 states and a reputation for effective legal challenges to corporate negligence. "Ready to get back to work?" Williams asked as they climbed into the van. Jake and Scarlett looked at each other and smiled, understanding that their real work was just beginning. They'd spent months planning expansion of the Foundation's activities, developing programs that would address systematic injustice through legal rather than criminal methods. The drive to Denver took them past the exit for Cedar Falls, where a historical marker now commemorated Miguel Martinez and the 46 other miners who died in preventable accidents at Phoenix Mining Corporation facilities. The company had been dissolved as part of the federal prosecution, its assets used to fund victim compensation and safety improvements. "Any regrets?" Jake asked as they passed the familiar landscape where their story had begun. Scarlett considered the question that had become a ritual between them, acknowledging both the costs and benefits of choices that had transformed their lives completely. "None," she said, reaching for his hand. "We're exactly where we need to be." 6 months later, Jake and Scarlett stood before a packed auditorium at the University of Colorado, delivering a joint lecture about institutional accountability and the ethics of civil disobedience. Their story had become a case study in law, schools, business schools, and ethics programs across the country. "We're not here to advocate for bank robbery," Jake told the audience of students, faculty, and community members. "We're here to discuss what happens when legal channels fail and ordinary people face choices between complicity and resistance." Their presentation balanced acknowledgement of their criminal actions with analysis of the systematic failures that had made those actions feel necessary. They discussed alternative approaches they might have pursued, legal remedies that existed but were controlled by the same interests they were trying to challenge, and the importance of exhausting legitimate options before considering illegal alternatives. "The question isn't whether our actions were legal," Scarlett explained. "The question is whether institutions exist to serve people, or whether people exist to serve institutions." During the question and answer session, a law student asked whether they would make the same choices again, knowing what they knew about the consequences and alternatives. Jake and Scarlett exchanged the look that had become their private language, communicating complex thoughts through expressions that reflected 18 months of shared danger, imprisonment, advocacy, and love. "We would hope to find legal ways to achieve the same outcomes," Scarlett replied carefully. "But if legal channels were blocked by the same corruption we were trying to expose, if families continued suffering preventable tragedies while institutions protected corporate interests, yes, we would make the same choices again." The answer generated applause from some audience members and concerned murmurs from others, reflecting the ongoing debate about their case and its implications for American democracy. After the lecture, they drove to a small restaurant where they'd planned to celebrate the second anniversary of their meeting in that alley behind Main Street in Cedar Falls. The date had become personally significant, the moment when their separate stories of desperation and disillusionment had merged into something larger than either could have achieved alone. 2 years ago, you robbed a bank, Jake said, raising his glass of wine in a toast. 2 years ago, you helped me escape, Scarlett replied, clinking her glass against his. And now we're outlaws in the best possible way. They'd been married 6 weeks after their release from federal prison, in a ceremony attended by Martinez Foundation staff, mining safety advocates, and the families. They'd helped through their advocacy work. The wedding had been covered by media outlets as a symbol of love triumphing over institutional opposition, though Jake and Scarlett preferred to think of it as two people who'd found each other during the worst circumstances imaginable. The Martinez Foundation now employed 47 people across 8 states, had helped secure compensation for over 200 families affected by preventable industrial accidents, and had contributed to safety legislation in 12 states. More importantly, it had created networks of support that connected isolated victims with resources and advocacy that might otherwise remain unavailable. What's next? Scarlett asked as they finished their anniversary dinner. Jake consulted the notebook where he'd been tracking foundation activities and planning future expansion. They'd received requests for assistance from communities dealing with chemical plant explosions, construction site failures, and transportation accidents that suggested patterns of corporate negligence similar to what they'd exposed in the mining industry. Everything, he replied. There's so much work to do, so many families that need help, so many institutions that need accountability. The scope of systematic injustice could feel overwhelming, but Jake and Scarlett had learned to focus on individual cases rather than abstract policy reforms. Every family they helped represented lives saved, communities protected, and institutions forced to acknowledge human costs that they preferred to ignore. As they drove home through the Colorado countryside, passing landscapes that reminded them of their journey down the Yellowstone River as federal fugitives, they discussed plans for expanding the Foundation's work into new areas of corporate accountability and victim advocacy. Do you think we'll ever be normal? Scarlett asked as they turned into the driveway of the house they'd purchased using book proceeds from their story. Jake parked the car and looked at the woman who'd transformed his understanding of justice, love, and the possibility of creating meaning from tragedy. Normal had never been their goal. They'd been seeking purpose, connection, and the opportunity to build something valuable from the wreckage of their previous lives. I hope not, he said, leaning over to kiss her. Normal people don't change anything. Inside their house, the walls were covered with photographs from Foundation events, letters from families they'd helped, and news articles about legislation that had resulted from their advocacy. The home felt like a headquarters for ongoing revolution rather than a retreat from public engagement. Before bed, they reviewed the day's emails and planned the next week's activities, legislative hearings in Montana, a conference presentation in Washington, meetings with families who'd requested Foundation assistance. Their calendar was packed with the kind of meaningful work that had seemed impossible during their previous lives. Jake? Scarlett said as they turned off the lights. Yeah, thank you for helping me escape. Thank you for giving me something worth escaping to. They'd been saying variations of this exchange for 2 years, acknowledging that their meeting had saved them both from lives that had become unbearable. Their crime had been the beginning of their redemption. Their illegal partnership had evolved into legitimate collaboration, and their love had proven that connection could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. Outside their bedroom window, the Colorado mountains rose against a star-filled sky, that reminded them of nights spent as fugitives planning their surrender. They'd traveled an impossible distance from that abandoned copper mine, where they'd first realized that their individual tragedies could become collective action. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new families seeking help, new institutions requiring accountability. But tonight, they could rest in the knowledge that their choices had mattered, that their love had endured, and that their story would continue inspiring others who faced impossible circumstances and needed examples of resistance, redemption, and hope. They had robbed a bank, stolen each other's hearts, and discovered that sometimes the greatest crime is accepting injustice without fighting back. In the end, they'd become exactly what their names promised when spoken together: Sullivan and Martinez, two outlaws who'd found a way to make the world a little more just, one family at a time. Some crimes, they'd learned, were worth committing. Some love was worth every risk. And some stories were worth telling, regardless of the consequences. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.